Good morning, everybody. I think that was a pretty good introduction. I have the privilege of presenting on behalf of a lot of people today. So there was over 200 experts involved in the process, and I particularly wanted to acknowledge Katie Sandbrook, who's here today in our team, and she did the slides as well, which are very neat, and also Mari Carmen Pineda, who is based in Spain these days. The beauty of online. All right, so I'm going to give you an overview of the process, and we may not have time to touch on the impacts, but I will refer you to some additional material as well. So the scientific consensus statement is done approximately every 5 years. This one, the evidence went through to the end of 2022, and we used material from 1990 through to that period. So around 30 years of evidence has been pulled together. It's used to support the update of the Water Quality Improvement Plan, as Maria said, but it also has other applications in pulling together the current evidence. And it helps to create a common understanding about the runoff of pollutants and river discharge from the land to the Great Barrier Reef and its impacts on ecosystems and how that can be managed. As Maria mentioned, and I'll continue to reiterate this, it's just one piece of the puzzle. So this is pulling together the peer-reviewed, published and publicly available evidence, but there's obviously a lot of knowledge in the community and in this room, even here, to contribute to things like the update of the plan. So just wanting to remind everybody that this isn't where the evidence stops. In terms of its scope, so it covers the whole Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area and the adjacent catchment area. I just wanted to highlight, I guess, the connectivity between those systems, and especially too, you can see as you move from north to south the distance of the reef from the coast. So the northern Great Barrier Reef is quite close to the coast. As you move further south, it tends to be further offshore. But the inshore ecosystems are really important as well. That's where a lot of the seagrass sits, and that's the area where we often use, and a lot of the visitation occurs in those inshore areas. The actual scope of the consensus statement is the marine ecosystems, so coral reef, seagrass, other ecosystems and species where we had information, but also freshwater wetlands in the catchment as well. In terms of the land uses, it's the same as what's considered in the Paddock to Reef program, so the major land uses, and this breakup that I'll show here is across the whole Great Barrier Reef, but that's not too dissimilar from what we see in the Burdekin. So a lot of the land is used for grazing, other crops like sugarcane, a little bit of horticulture. And the primary pollutants that we looked at were nutrients, so particulate and dissolved, fine sediments and pesticides, and then other pollutants. So a range of more of the, I guess, emerging pollutants like microplastics, coal dust, pharmaceutical products, and a range of other materials. Just to highlight here what we see in the Burdekin region, so the map on your left shows the different zones. So you'll hear me talking about inshore, mid-shelf and offshore. The darkest shading is the inshore, the stripes are the mid-shelf, and the outer reef is in the dots. And then we can see what we have in the Burdekin region. So the seagrass is fairly spread across. It's one of the largest seagrass areas in the Great Barrier Reef in inshore and mid-shelf as well as offshore. So the offshores tend to be deeper. The coral reefs are largely located in the mid and off-shelf area, but as I mentioned, there's those important inshore ecosystems that you've probably visited, Magnetic Island, Palm Island, those sorts of places. And then the wetlands, it's one of the largest areas of proportions of wetlands in the whole Great Barrier Reef catchment. So I wanted to go through the process that we've adopted to develop the consensus statement. So we started it in October 2021 and it was released in August. So it was very comprehensive and took a few years, and hopefully you'll get a gist of why. So we were contracted, so C2O Consulting, by the Australian and Queensland government to undertake the process independently. So drew in a whole bunch of experts to work with us on that. And we've tried to use our best available processes in terms of question setting, author selection, peer review, consensus, and then the final publication. For the very first time, we had the oversight of Australia's Chief Scientist, Dr. Cathy Foley, involved. So she was appointed by the Prime Minister at the beginning to oversee the project, and her role was really to look to ensure that we were using the best available processes. And the idea of having a lot of these additional steps in place, and not to say that the previous consensus statements weren't rigorous, but we did have feedback that the process needed to be more open and transparent, and to build, I guess, additional trust in the outputs that we were generating. And part of that too was having an opportunity to keep stakeholders informed, also inviting them to help us define the questions and submit literature as well. So that we can assess whether or not we've done a lot of those things, we had a number of guiding principles that were defined by a number of groups involved. So our chief technical review group is the Independent Science Panel. And Dr. Foley also had input to what these principles should be. So it's about minimising bias in terms of the author's compilation and synthesis and communication of the final conclusions, the independence, so that's the appointment of our team, making sure the process were fit for purpose, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, having confidence in the evidence and the process, but also for the first time we assessed the level of confidence in the evidence for each question, ensuring the processes are transparent and they're all very well documented, and then some level of engagement and accessibility of the outputs. In terms of the major steps, so as I said, we started in October 2021 and we had a question setting process. We started out with 120 questions that policy wanted us to answer, and we managed to prioritise that down to 30. So we had stakeholder input to that. We had a very open call for authors, so we had 3 rounds of expressions of interest to over 500 people, and then we had the development of the methods, which I'll talk a little bit more in a sec. Authors went away, they pulled together their synthesis, we had a very comprehensive peer review process, and then established consensus about what some of the key findings were. And I'll talk a bit about that. There's approach documents that capture all of that as well, and they have been considered by Dr. Foley, and she's got a statement of assurance that she's included in the report. In terms of the output, so there's, as I mentioned, there's 30 questions, and that's where the greatest level of detail is. So that's where you'll find detailed answers to the questions, and each of them has a summary, like around 1.5 pages, that we call evidence statements, and they feed into a summary document. And that's where we started the process with agreement between the 35 experts that were involved leading the questions. It's around 100 pages, so it's not especially short, but it does provide that next level of info up. And then the conclusions, and that's largely what I'll present today. But there's 8 high-level conclusions, and that was pushed very hard by policy as they needing something at that highest level. We had some reluctance from authors to do that because we start to, I guess, generalise once you get to those level, but it's a really important output as well. In terms of the scope, so we've got we've got 8 themes altogether. So the first couple of themes cover off on the values and the current condition and threats to the Great Barrier Reef. The middle themes are around the individual pollutants, and then within those we consider where do they go, what are their impacts, how do they get to the end of the catchment, and what are their sources, as well as the management options in terms of their effectiveness, their costs and the productivity outcomes. The 7th theme is around human dimension. So how have the programs, how effective have they been? What are some of the barriers and enablers for adoption? And then a question around traditional owner involvement, which we'll hear a bit about today. And then a couple of questions at the end around the future directions around monitoring, evaluation and co-benefits, which is obviously something of interest to a lot of people. A little bit more about each of the steps. So the synthesis method that we use, so for answering each of the questions, we engaged an independent expert, Rob Richards from Evidentiary, to help us develop a very systematic method for developing those answers. So it included strict search requirements from each of the authors. It's a very repeatable method, and it's a very standard template. So if you've seen the previous consensus statement, it was 5 chapters. So these 30 questions all have a very, they have the same template that we authors have been required to strictly adhere to that. The potential for bias was minimised through various steps that were undertaken, and all of the evidence was appraised for several aspects in terms of the quantity of the evidence, the consistency, how relevant is it to the Great Barrier Reef, is it a study that is relevant to other locations, or is it really those findings only relevant to that one spot? And that has come out in terms of how people then emphasise that in their final conclusions and key findings. So for the first time, we assessed the level of confidence, and that took into account those aspects of relevance and consistency. And so, for example, where you have multiple lines of evidence, so we might have monitoring studies, modelling studies, remote sensing, some tracing, all these evidence is stacking up to tell us the same result. So that gives us higher confidence in those outcomes, and also the number of studies that are consistently showing that result as well. The peer review process was very comprehensive, so we, under the direction of Dr. Foley and government, we established an editorial board. So we had an editor-in-chief who sort of chaired that group, and then 6 members or editors, and they were each given questions where they were oversaw the process. For each question, we had a couple of reviewers, so at least one GBR sort of relevant expert and an international or national expert. So with a total of 63 reviewers, it ended up being a much bigger process than we ever thought that we would embark on. And for some of the questions, we had 3 reviewers. And the approach was similar to what you'd use for a journal, only more comprehensive. We had a very strict template that then matched our requirements for the evidence reviews to make sure that the authors had, for example, not drawn conclusions that didn't match the evidence base that they'd brought together, or were overemphasising something that perhaps was only found in limited studies. So the reviewers had a big job as well. They came back. We had a very strict process of where the authors were required to respond and document their responses to every comment, which was signed off by the editors. For the final document, so the summary and conclusions, we had an additional 3 independent expert reviewers. They were a couple international and a national reviewer with expertise across the whole breadth of the evidence base. For the consensus process, this was once we were getting to the end, so about this time last year. So that material was brought together into 2 major documents. So the summary, so we had 35 experts, and we had a consensus working group to guide this process. So we had what we call a single draft text procedure. So basically our team drafted it. It went to small groups, so they're based in their themes of 7 to 9 people. They reviewed it, made comments independently. We moderated that and went back to them until we reached agreement. We did that in 3 rounds. And then that material formed the basis to the actual conclusion. So that's this document. There's some copies on the back, and they were developed through a interactive workshop. So the only time we all got together and actually talked to each other in person to develop a final set of conclusions, and that was agreed by everybody in that group. In terms of our headline numbers, as I mentioned, it's been a massive process. I've talked to some of these numbers already. Overall, there were 78 authors and contributors. We had a number of expert working groups. We had all of our peer reviewers and also the oversight from the chief scientist. We also had the Queensland's chief scientist involved as well, but there was a couple of changeovers throughout the process. And in the end, Professor Kerry Wilson wasn't end up in the final process because she had been involved in some of our committees prior to her appointment as chief scientist. One of the things that we can do with the evidence, so all of the authors were required to pull together a reference database, and we can analyse that to pull out some of the stats and figures around those references. So the Queensland University of Technology, Tay Stewart has done some work which she's continuing to work on, but just wanted to show a couple of the headline numbers here. And the plot on the left shows the number of publications that are used across the whole evidence base over the different years of the consensus statement's development. So we can see we're continuously improving the evidence base, and that evidence base is also continually growing. So in the 2022 one, we used around 4,000 publications, which is almost double or what was used previously, and then the number of authors. So the total number of authors listed across that whole evidence base has almost tripled to 9,000 authors in this current iteration. So it's very comprehensive. So I'll touch on the conclusions, which, as I mentioned, they're here, and I just wanted to go through those, but I encourage you to have a look at this document as well. So as a reminder, so these were developed by the 35 experts involved in the consensus process, and we're basically trying to establish what are the high-level messages that we have agreement on with strong evidence across the whole evidence space. So the first one is really recognising that water quality has changed and why. So as a result of historical and continuing land management and catchment modification, we've seen vegetation clearing, modification of hydrology has led to changes in water quality influencing the Great Barrier Reef. The second one is to what degree we understand that. So pollutant loads have increased, and that's supported by multiple lines of evidence, monitoring, modelling, other sources of information. So for fine sediments, 1.4 to 5 times, and for dissolved inorganic nitrogen, 1.5 to 3 times. And those ranges are there because it varies across the basin. So I should highlight that when I'm talking about these conclusions, I'm talking across the whole Great Barrier Reef, but of course there's specific results relevant to each region and each location, and they do vary a lot. The third one is in relation to that poor water quality is still an issue for the Great Barrier Reef, and in terms of fine sediments, dissolved inorganic nitrogen, particulate nutrients and pesticides. And we do continue to see impacts on those, but really emphasising that those impacts are largely in those inshore areas and looking back, so into the estuary and freshwater systems as well. In the northern Great Barrier Reef, where I showed that the reef is closer to the coast, you will see those impacts occurring in the mid-shelf and sometimes offshore areas as well. And the fourth one recognises the role of water quality in the context of other threats. So climate change is by far the greatest threat to the Great Barrier Reef, but good water quality has a really important role, especially in recovery in those following those big disturbance events, and we've got increasing evidence about that as well. So meeting the targets that Maria talked about in the next 10 years is imperative, and there's a lot of evidence stacking up around that as well. The fifth one is about land management practices. So we've got good knowledge of quite a few of them, and that they are cost effective. There are some gaps though, and ensuring that we can translate that into actual change, which means working with people and identifying those hotspots. We also have some gaps in the knowledge around cost effectiveness in particular and potential co-benefits which might help with adoption. And the sixth one is just, I guess, emphasising that having locally effective solutions, as you were mentioning in the previous discussion, is really important. There's evidence about that when it's designed locally and in collaboration with a range of partners, that's where the successful stories are starting to become very clear. The seventh one is about monitoring, modelling and evaluation. So the Paddock to Reef program is demonstrated to be a world-class monitoring evaluation program, but there are gaps, and these came up across several questions, particularly in relation to the spatial and temporal coverage of some of the aspects, some particular land uses, for example, horticulture and bananas, some of the pollutants, and also we've got some really long-term data sets, so there's a need to do more trend analysis and identify where the gaps are, or fill the uncertainty. And the eighth one is really about that research effort. So every question's got an identification of the knowledge gaps for that question. These are just the highest level ones that came up again and again across a number of questions. So really about the co-benefits and the efficiency, including the costs of the management actions, which can be quite variable. They're very important to understand that across a range of landscapes and climate conditions. The effectiveness of programs and instruments, so that's typically not well covered in the evidence, and it's obviously in the literature or in people's programs, not necessarily in the published literature, and then risks from a wider range of ecosystems. But I will refer you to these. So there's, in the conclusions document, there's the summary of the strength of the evidence, so where we have strong foundational evidence, where there's still some uncertainties or disagreement within the science, and where the information is emerging. We've also highlighted what the recent findings are, and I'll just point you to the final output. So there's the conclusions, there's all of the questions, and these are all at the back of the room. There's also a set of frequently asked questions, which are 34 questions, answers in a summary paragraph. And there's topic summaries that we've actually pulled together for each of the key land uses. So might be useful for extension type work. They're 2 pages. They talk about where this material come from, where are the hotspots, what are the impacts, what are some of the management options, and then we've got a website. But before I do finish, I just want to acknowledge everybody that has been involved. There are some authors here today, which you'll hear from, which will be great to hear a little bit more detail. And yeah, thank you for giving me the time to speak today.